Welcome to the first EPRC webinar of the spring series. My name is Carlos Mendez and I'm a director at the EPRC at the Department of Government and Public Policy, University of Strathclyde. Today we're welcoming Liam Sides from Oxford Economics, who'll present on the key economic challenges facing European cities in 2026. The presentation will last around 30 minutes or so, followed by a discussion. At that point, if you'd like to make an intervention, just raise your hand or post a question in the chat and we can address these in the Q&A. The webinar is being recorded so that you and colleagues can follow it at a later date, which will circulate also via our YouTube channel. Let me present our speaker today. Liam Sides heads the Global City Analysis in Oxford Economics Cities and Regions Unit. His team produces economic and demographic forecasts for cities and regions across Europe and globally, and works with local and national governments as well as central banks and companies to highlight future growth trends across the world. Before joining Oxford Economics, Liam was a UK civil servant, most recently serving as the head of analysis in the Levelling Up task force. Let me pass over to you, Liam. Please feel free to share your slides.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And it's great to be back talking to an organisation I obviously had relatively close links with when I was a civil servant myself. I've got a lot to get through today. So what I'm going to do is split the presentation basically into three parts. I'm going to start by outlining the drivers of Europe's industrial weakness. Obviously, this has been sort of spoken about a lot over the last few years. I'll go into some of the drivers of this. I then want to highlight the challenges posed by the housing market to Europe's major cities. And then I'm just going to finish up by looking at some room for optimism. And I'm talking here the sort of green shoots of growth that's going on across Europe. To kick off, though, I want to highlight the core trend in this year's forecast that we have at Oxford Economics, and that is diverging economic performance between major cities and the rest. So at the start of every year, we produce a set of key themes for the world's regional economies. And this year, Europe was really at the center of those key themes. And that was the impacts of trade, from China, from artificial intelligence, and from the housing market. And these themes impact in all parts of Europe, big and small, urban and rural. But these were the four themes that sort of sat around our global outlook for cities across the world. And clearly, there's such a European element to each of these. Yet the central point that comes through in our sort of outlook, at least for this year, but actually the sort of medium term more broadly, is divergence. And this is divergence between Europe's service-oriented large cities, who we think have diverse and resilient economies, able to manage current global headwinds, and Europe's industrial base, which we see as being under significant pressure that we don't think is being alleviated anytime soon. And at the center of this is sort of Europe's manufacturing heavy regions that we see as being highly exposed. And we see its performance as lagging. This seriously, though, exposes specific regions, and that is Germany's industrial heartlands, but also Austria, Czechia, and northern Italy. And here I've just got a map showing share of GDP in manufacturing. That I think if we went back sort of 10, 15 years ago, we might have been looking at this and saying, well, this is a force for strength in these local economies. I don't think we're thinking the same thing at the moment, and I'll go into detail about that in a minute. But you can see that this isn't new. Europe's industrial economy is being squeezed from the sort of global relevance over the last 25 years. And this is a trend that we think will not only continue, but actually may even accelerate over the coming years. And again, I'll go into this in more detail, but you can see here, Europe, given by the relatively darker blue line in the middle, you can see that share of industrial output globally falling, particularly as China and India have burst onto the global scene. And we forecast things to get worse this year before they get better. So we think European manufacturing will be far weaker than last year, And this is largely due to the fact that last year the impact from tariffs and other such things was sort of alleviated to some extent by front loading of trade. So you can see highlighted by the sort of dark blue star, that was Europe's industrial manufacturing growth last year. This year's the red bar shows that decline, quite significant decline actually in manufacturing growth between last year and this year. And unfortunately for Europe, this weakness is coming on top of nearly 2 decades of near zero productivity growth in Europe's largest economies. The UK and France have performed almost identically poorly, as the UK and France tend to do against most economic metrics, perform very similar to each other. Italy performs incredibly poorly. It wasn't even performing very well in the sort of growth phase of the 20 years up to 2007. It's basically now non-existent productivity growth. And Germany performs slightly better, although the collapse in productivity has been significant in the pre-2007 days to the post-2008 days. And I would just hazard a guess here on Germany. I haven't looked into this specifically, but if I was to look at Germany over the last 5 years, I imagine it goes to the bottom of this league table in terms of productivity growth over the last few years. And this collapse in productivity growth in Europe's largest economies is obviously bad for living standards, it's bad for innovation, and I don't need to say this here, but it's bad for politics. I'm not going to go into that final point of it being bad for politics here, but I'm sure we can all take that sort of view away. It's also coming alongside significant demographic challenges, particularly in Southern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and parts of industrial Germany. The Nordics, the UK and Ireland are much less exposed to sort of these demographic headwinds. But what you can see here is that even major cities are highly exposed to declining working age populations. I think sometimes we tend to think of aging and depopulation as a rural phenomenon. That's not entirely true. Look at somewhere like Athens on this chart. Over the next 25 years, we predict that Athens' working age population will fall by over 30%. You can see all these sort of red bubbles underneath the zero line are all seeing declining working age populations over the next 25 years. Europe, alongside South Korea, Japan, and China, are all at the center of these sort of demographic declines globally. But let me be really clear. Not everything is negative. As I've already mentioned here, I've got a section at the end that's going to talk about some of these green shoots, but many European cities and regions are growing exceptionally, particularly cities in Central and Eastern Europe. And this is largely driven by strong productivity growth. So while the core, the advanced economies, the large economies in the center are not seeing productivity growth, that is not true in places, in cities across Central and Eastern Europe. So while diverging fortunes between advanced service sector cities and more industrial hubs are central to our forecasts, there is obviously convergence occurring between what has historically been Europe's periphery and the core. And that is an important development that shouldn't be overlooked. And some of these growth rates that I'm highlighting here have been strong over the last 15 years and even strong over the last 5 years as well. So there's a lot of room for optimism across Europe. But let me first talk about the more pessimistic side, which is this outlook of divergence that I've already mentioned, and particularly the industrial weakness that's being seen across Europe. And there's 4 key factors I want to highlight that are exposing industrial regions more than others. So first, tariffs and trade restrictions. These obviously have a much more limited impact on service exports and a much stronger impact on goods exports. So if I was to take one country as an example here that has had more trade restrictions than maybe others in Europe over the last decade, of the UK, if I look at the latest sort of trade data that came out recently, it shows service exports at a record high surplus and goods exports at a record high deficit. You can see there the impact of tariffs and trade restrictions are uneven. Service sector economies less exposed, industrial places more exposed. Second, many European countries now have the highest energy prices in the world. Not all of them, but many of them do. Again, this has a much more limited and indirect impact on service sector economies and a huge impact on manufacturing economies. I would emphasize on this point around energy prices, do not underestimate the extent to which high energy prices are curtailing investment and leading to a loss of competitiveness. This is the factor that comes up time and time again with our clients as being the main thing about why they are holding back investment in Europe is energy prices. Third, and for me, the biggest change of the decade is the rise of China in higher value added industries. For me, there's a new apex predator on the block, basically, and Europe's industrial regions are seriously exposed to this development. And the strength of China's industry from both a quality and a cost perspective is impacting on many regions. Fourth, the AI revolution, as we might want to call it, is most likely to benefit cities with strong tech, IT, and advanced services sectors. Once again, this is highly concentrated in major cities like London, Paris, Stockholm. And to sort of reinforce these points, let me just go into the slides quickly. I won't dwell on this one very long, but basically US tariffs have undermined European competitiveness in the US market.
Sorry, Liam, I don't think your slides are visible anymore, at least not for me. Are they for you, Marina? Ruth?
They're visible on my side.
Okay, apologies.
Yeah,
Carry
visible
on.
for me too.
This makes me feel a lot better. I don't know what's happening there for you, Carlos. Shall I continue?
Please do. They're back. Thank you.
They're back. They're back. Oh gosh, you worried me there. But as I was saying, US tariffs have undermined European competitiveness in US markets. Given there is a significant number of exports going to this region, it seriously saps output in more industrial parts of Europe. And these are highly concentrated in specific places. Again, it's Germany's industrial heartlands, particularly those in the auto sector, and particularly those that have a large share of exports to the US. You can see it in places like Bremen, Brunswick, Wolfsburg, and so on and so forth. Big export percentage going to the US, big sectors that export to the US. Autos are obviously at the center of that, which is what this map's showing, but it's also showing farmer cities as well. The farmer picture hasn't evolved maybe in the way we all expected when the Trump administration came in, but it is being impacted by uncertainty, and it is being impacted actually by many farmer companies sort of being forced to invest in the US when maybe they otherwise would have invested in Europe in these regions. So tariffs are having a sort of very regional impact on these industrial hubs across Europe. Second, and I think more importantly, are energy prices. And energy prices have increased significantly. And if current forecasts are to be believed, this is not a short-term trend. It seems likely that prices will peak in around 2030 and remain high for much of the next 25 years. I haven't even included what's happening in Iran at the moment and the impact that has on the energy markets and any of this. But this is a colossal cost to bear for European industry, and it is a key driver in weakening investment into the sector. If I then break out sort of industrial sector trends in Europe into two parts, so energy intensive industries on the sort of red line here, and the rest of industry on the blue line, you can clearly see that these energy prices are having a particularly big impact on undermining energy intensive sectors, and you can see the collapse in production over the last 5 years is clear to see. And it almost makes it look like the rest of industry is performing quite well, when really that is treading water as well. So if you look at the blue line where we are today in terms of rest of industry indexed to 2021 in terms of GVA and industrial output, it's basically the same level of output as 2018. So it's treading water itself. GVA in the sector is not increasing. So industry as a whole is being impacted, but energy intensive sectors are the most impacted. That's a very clear sign that energy costs are causing a significant impact on European industry. Sort of building on that, the chemical sector has been hit particularly hard. Obviously, this is a relatively small sector of the economy, but it's highly important. And the chart here really shows the chemical sector with the red line, and historically, the chemical sector output has moved in line with wider industrial production. Obviously, that's understandable given it's a key component into wider manufacturing production. That relationship holds no more, and that implies a structural change in recent years, not a blip. And some regions have seen their chemicals industry collapse. And I'm thinking places here like, I don't know, cities along the Rhine, cities around Bavaria, and then a city like Antwerp. These cities have seen huge falls in chemicals output over the last 5 years, and these falls haven't recovered. This tells me that production probably isn't coming back, and that a lot of it is relocated to places like China and the US, where energy prices are much lower and regulations are much lower. And I know there's been a lot of case studies already looking into this, but this isn't a blip. This is a significant decline in one European sector as a result, to some extent, of high energy prices. And this just shows you some of the places across Europe most impacted by that chemical sector decline. You can see there Antwerp and a number of German cities. Third, China and China's move up value chains. So the chart here clearly shows the sort of growth in basic metals and high-tech goods over time, and our forecast shows China's move in the future is into much more high-tech goods. This is undermining the competitiveness from any. So sorry, no, it's not. In combination with the undermining of competitiveness from energy prices, we're also seeing a new competitor on the block. Well, I say new competitor, a new competitor on the block in really advanced sectors of the economy, and that's China. If we think about the industries that China is now dominating, which are, I don't know, batteries, EVs, semiconductors, solar panels, wind turbines. I mean, I could continue, to be honest. China is doing pretty well. And these are the industries that we are demanding and buying from as well. China also holds much of the world's supply of the critical minerals that go into these goods. This seriously exposes Europe's industrial base, particularly where industries are undergoing seismic change and moving into new technologies. And I'm thinking here the move from sort of ICE automotives into EVs. China's able to leapfrog many European producers in moving into these new frontiers of the industry. And you can clearly see this by looking at export similarity between China and other advanced economies. So this chart here shows time frame on the x-axis, export similarity on the y-axis. So it looks at China's export basket of goods and compares how similar it is to other parts of the world. The Eurozone is the most exposed to this, with China's export basket increasingly similar to the Eurozone's export basket. This reduces export market potential in China, it increases competition in domestic markets, and it raises competition in global markets. This only goes up to 2023, this chart. I imagine if I sort of extrapolate this out now to 2025, we'd see a much more similar basket of goods given what it is that China's producing and exporting. That saps a big market for Europe that drove a lot of growth, particularly in somewhere like Germany post-financial crisis. That market's closing off, and it's also meaning you're exposing your own market and your third-party export markets. And it exposes specific economies. So this looks at the percentage of industrial exports competing with China's growth sectors, and you can see European national economies highly exposed to what it is that China is trying to grow. Well, where China's high growth sectors are. Slovakia and Czechia highly exposed, but actually the difference in terms of percentages here between these top places is quite low. So Germany, France, Spain are also highly exposed as well. And then finally, I mentioned how cities like London and Paris are probably best placed to take advantage of the AI boom. Well, to some extent, in certain national economies, that is actually already happening. And I'm looking at here the location of data centers in the UK. Today, they are already highly urban-centric, and future announcements of where data centers are going to be suggest that is only likely to increase. I should note, this isn't the case for everywhere in Europe. Nordic countries have much more rural infrastructure of data centers, but on the whole, data center development, which is a sort of proxy to some extent for AI development, is highly urban. Second, we believe the most exposed sectors to AI and automation are likely to be industrial rather than service-based. We can discuss this in the questions afterwards if you want, because I know this flies in the face of some predictions out there. But the chart here shows an example from the US that, don't get me wrong, it's looking at robotics and automation, not specifically AI here. But it shows that the most exposed sectors are the most industrial ones. So yes, we might see productivity growth in industrial sectors over the next few years. Will we see jobs growth? I'm skeptical, and you're not seeing jobs growth in industrial sectors in the US at the moment. It's all productivity driven. But I'm not gonna labour on that point too long. But overall, our outlook is expect divergence. We are relatively bullish on major cities with strong service sector economies. Our outlook for industrial parts of Europe is weak and worrying. Yet, even in major cities, there are challenges, and the big one is housing. And for those on the call that are from the UK or Nordic countries, this might seem obvious. High housing costs have been an issue for a long time. This is nothing new to us. The difference is that a large number of other cities that were previously a lot more affordable are now facing their own housing crises. So first, one I want to show here is we produce a housing price index at Oxford Economics that looks at countries across Europe and the sort of change in house prices from 2015 onwards. On this map here, the darker red represents the most significant falls in housing affordability over time, the white less significant falls. Interestingly, the places with the most expensive housing markets, i.e. those that are the most unaffordable, have the most limited house price increases over the last 10 years. It's almost like they are so expensive, there's no more room for growth. Elsewhere, the same is not true. And in fact, I think the stat here is average house prices across the near 80 major European cities we cover have risen significantly since 2015. I think almost a third of the cities have seen their house price levels double over the last 10 years. That is a substantial increase in housing prices. It's a substantial fall in housing affordability. And you can see from the red dots here, the places most impacted from it. And at the center of the trends, where are they? It's basically Europe's periphery, so your Central and Eastern European cities, it's your Nordic cities, and it's your Dutch cities. And with the exception of these Dutch and Nordic cities, it's basically the places that were previously affordable that have seen the most significant house price growth. And that includes your sort of second tier cities in the UK as well, that have historically been relatively affordable. The last 10 years have changed that picture. And it is within these countries, it's the major cities that have seen the increases most significantly in house prices. So the national picture when you're looking at house prices really does cloud regional dynamics. So I've chosen an example of looking at Spanish house prices since 2015. And the places with the rapid house price increases are those major cities. And it's those major cities that are attracting inflows of younger workers. They have more diverse economies and they perform strongly in tourism and livability indices. So it's not a picture of it's happening across the board in a country. It's very specific cities driving these national trends. Another area that's sort of central to these house price growth trends is the Nordic region. And the reason I've picked the Nordic region here is, one, they've seen really significant house price growth and we expect that to continue. Two, there is one city bucking that trend within the region, and that's Helsinki. And there's an interesting reason for that I'll go into in a minute. But what you can see here is significant growth expected over 2025, that to continue over the period 25 to 30, and then actually our long-term growth trends for housing in these house prices in these cities remains very high, except for Helsinki. And you can see this on the chart here. It comes through very strongly. Helsinki is bucking the trend in terms of rapid house price growth compared to other Nordic capital cities. Why is that? Well, this chart shows it in quite good, in quite a good way. They are building houses. And how does the chart show that? Well, you can see that new dwelling growth has exceeded household growth. If I was to show you the same for Stockholm, Oslo, or anywhere else in the Nordic region, you would see actually that household growth is exceeding new dwelling growth. So essentially the red dotted line would be above the blue bar charts if I was to show these other cities. For Helsinki, that's not the case. And that really brings us to what's been driving these price dynamics across Europe's major cities, and that has been housing delivery is the sort of main thing. We've had the collapse in construction sector post 2008 not recovering, and that has led to mismatches between supply and demand. There've also been other factors smaller household size, increasing demand for housing, concentration of economic activity in more urban areas, and huge increases in tourism. I don't know as much about the tourism side as some of my colleagues in Oxford Economics, but tourism definitely plays a role within this. From a policy perspective, and I think that's worth mentioning given the people I'm talking to now, the response across many countries and cities has actually been to undermine housing supply. We can talk about, you can ask questions on this at the end, but London is a good example of where well-intentioned policies around affordable housing quotas and building regulations have actually led to housing supply collapsing quite significantly. So if you look at somewhere like London, housing starts and completions are at historic lows here. We're talking falls exceeding around 80% compared to the average of previous decades. These are significant issues for economies like London's. If you're not building houses, you can't attract skilled labour. You can't keep prices down for a consumer economy to boom. These are significant problems for somewhere like London. I'm looking at the policy response of other European cities, and I'm seeing them coming out with affordable housing quotas. I think that is a route to basically getting no housing and very unaffordable housing long term if you're putting the cost on developers from that perspective. So far, I have been very pessimistic on European growth. That is wrong to do. In truth, Europe has significant potential. Part of that is because of the framing of this presentation, but I really did want to get in a few of the green shoots that I wanted to mention around Europe as well. First, our outlook is for substantial growth across many regions, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. And this growth is very productivity driven. You can see that from the difference in GDP growth forecasts that we've got over the next 15 years for these top economies and the jobs growth. This is productivity driven growth. It's driving huge increase in living standards in these regions. It's increasing concentrations of tech, IT, and advanced manufacturing firms that are driving it. And it's creating really diverse growth in these Central and Eastern European cities. Interestingly, it's also reversing decades of brain drain as wages in these places are actually catching up with their Western peers. So I actually think there's a really interesting positive story for Central and Eastern Europe. Second, much of this activity is in the much discussed and much pessimistically explained industrial sector and in the industrial cities within which they sit. Again, Central and Eastern European cities are at the center of these trends, and they're taking advantage basically of a deep skills base, moves into more advanced manufacturing, really efficient and strong infrastructure, and broader cost competitiveness. So while European economies are exposed to China, those in Central and Eastern Europe are actually better able to compete. They've got a much stronger cost competitiveness baseline to compete from. However, it's not just Central and Eastern Europe. And one city to me that stands out that I just think is an excellent one to bring out when thinking about Europe is Eindhoven, that obviously isn't in Central and Eastern Europe and is in the Netherlands. And over the last 15 years, I know that Eindhoven's growth has been phenomenal. So what this chart shows is the 10 fastest growing Western European cities over the last 15 years and the breakdown of the sectors that have been driving that growth. And you can see Eindhoven leading the way with its strong manufacturing base, Copenhagen second again with its strong manufacturing base. What does this tell me? It tells me you need to develop niche industrial advantages that solidify your position in global supply chains. What has Eindhoven done? Well, it has a semiconductor manufacturing base that is exceptional, it's uncomparable, it's very hard to compete with. What has Copenhagen done? It's done similar in pharmaceuticals. It's really interesting that those two are driving such strong growth by really honing in on their industrial advantages. Another one I want to highlight in here is Wolfsburg. You can see 5th strongest growing city in Western Europe over the last 15 years, advanced manufacturing at the center of that in the auto industry. I would guess if I was to look at this from 2019 to 2024, Wolfsburg would disappear quite quickly because that sector specifically is sort of at risk. But on the whole, you can see here, Europe has a lot of ingrained advantages across different cities, whether that's in manufacturing, whether it's in professional services, or whether it's in tech and IT. There's a lot of varied growth going on across Europe, and it's really exciting and interesting. Another big boost to industrial regions is defence spending, and we expect a significant lift to Europe's GDP from this. The issue that Europe's facing is how quickly can this demand for defence spending be absorbed by the producers and the industries within which the orders are going to. So you can see here this huge boom in new orders via the yellow line and the backlog in the grey line that moves alongside it. That means that a lot of the spending right now is not coming through. And this is why we think it will take time to filter through, and why we are actually a bit more sort of, I would say level-headed, but maybe more pessimistic in the short term about what this boost to defence and fiscal spending will mean for European economies. We think it will be dragged out over a longer period rather than a very big initial boost over the next few years. That partly explains why our manufacturing outlook this year and next year for European economies actually isn't very strong, but becomes stronger in the medium term. What you can see from this chart as well is that because of Germany's fiscal boost, almost half of their GDP gains over the next 5 years will be from that fiscal boost from the government investment and consumption sector. It really is having a very real impact on a country there that has performed very poorly since the pandemic. And particular regions will benefit from this. These are largely those that have seen the most significant fall in their wider manufacturing base. The skills are there already. A lot of the factories can be retrofitted. Don't get me wrong, I'm not underestimating the challenge of doing that, but it means that they are playing into a skills base that's already there, and you can already see the developments along the Rhine, in Bavaria, and in other industrial parts of Germany as well. So for much of the conversation around industrial pessimism, for house prices sapping economic growth and confidence, there clearly are significant growth spots in Europe, and we shouldn't sort of lose focus on that. So to summarize, and I promise I'm going to stop talking soon and open questions because I'm sure there's a lot of people wanting to ask them. Our overall sort of key theme over the next few years is divergence. We think that service-based cities are less impacted by global trends and more likely to benefit from them, while more industrial regions are highly exposed. And there's a multitude of pressures undermining European industry, from sort of fierce international competition, rising tariffs, higher energy prices, each of them combining to depress industrial output. But service sector cities face their own challenges, and we cannot underestimate housing there. I think often housing is spoken about as being this political issue. It is, but it's also an economic issue. One of the drivers of London's non-existent productivity growth over the last decade has been very, very high and unaffordable house prices. Why does it do that? Well, it stops labour, skilled labour, from moving to productive businesses. It means that efficient skills are not being matched in the labour market. We can't overlook the economic impact of not getting housing right. And then finally, it really isn't all doom and gloom. There are substantial pockets of opportunity, particularly in Central and Eastern European cities, where these cities are really flying high, and we expect that to continue going forward. The risk for policymakers is how you support those industries that are performing well while driving growth. Sorry, is how you support those industries that are not performing well while also driving growth where there are opportunities. That's not easy to do. Do you stick with your industrial profile today, or do you say, actually, this industrial profile is no longer competitive in a global market? We need to reskill people. We need to boost other industries. That is a decision for policymakers that is not an easy one. I'll stop there. That was a very sort of wide-ranging whistle-stop tour of lots of very complex and technical issues. So Carlos, I'll hand back to you and take any questions people might have.
Great, thanks, Liam. Yeah, that was an excellent presentation. I think your core argument was that this year and going forward will be a year of growing divergence, with major service sector cities performing better while industrial and more rural cities and regions falling behind. I think you highlighted four key pressures, including high energy costs, China's move up the value chain, along with weaker consumer demand, tariffs, of course, as well as the AI boom and rising house prices as increasing economic challenges. But also, as you say here, it's not all gloom. There are green shoots, in particular certain parts of Europe, certain sectors, and also in defence, providing major opportunities. Just one general question before we open up to get your views on in terms of policy responses. I mean, which types of cities do you think are best positioned, not just to grow over the next year, but forecasting into the future as you do, to remain resilient over time in the next 5 years and beyond? And what can policymakers learn from them? You have highlighted some examples: Central Europe, Eindhoven, Copenhagen. But the question is, what can be done in terms of policy responses, which of course is, as you said, it's not easy to do. But for example, in tariffs and industrial policy, should the priority be now to compensate affected sectors, diversify markets, or accelerate restructuring into new industries?
Or really good points. Really good points. Let me start off with the places that are most likely to do well and the policy response on the back of that. So the places most likely to do well are either those with a very advanced sector that's hard to compete with. So I'm thinking there, your Eindhoven, your Copenhagen, your Toulouse that's got the aerospace sector. Like, these are much harder to compete with. You just need to make sure you're at the top of your game with that. Make sure you're getting the skills pipeline going into it. Make sure you're working with the industry to combine industrial know-how with the universities that are nearby to ensure they're getting the skills pipeline that can keep them at the frontier. That is absolutely important to do. Second, places that are likely to perform strongly are those that are able to drive growth in their more advanced service sector economies. And I'm thinking they're your professional, scientific and technical industries, your IT and tech. And I am much more skeptical on sectoral policies driving outcomes in those sectors and in those places. I think that's about spatial policy. How do these cities, and it is largely cities, unfortunate for policymakers in this space, how do those cities make sure that they're able to attract the very highest skilled individuals and the most innovative businesses to where they're located? And that is about improving amenity offer of cities. It's about increasing housing supply, and it's about increasing your livability. It's all about attracting skilled workers to ensure you've got the foundations ready for growth so that these professional service sectors can grow on the back of it. I think your professional service sector will actually perform relatively well over the next 5-10 years. There's significant global demand for these services. It's about which places are going to drive that growth, and it is your more major cities that are going to be able to tap into it. So that's the second type of thing, of place, and the policies that will support it. And then thirdly, there's clearly something happening in Central and Eastern Europe. Part of it is your sort of academically and economically well-known catch-up growth that's occurring in these places. But they're also doing things right that span the two examples that I've mentioned already. They know what their strengths are, so they have a good pipeline of skills going into the industries that they want to grow to help them move up the value chain. They also know that diversity is a strength when it comes to sectoral mix. They aren't just focusing on manufacturing sectors. If you look at somewhere like Tallinn or Warsaw, they're driving significant growth in tech, finance and insurance, and business services as well. So they understand you need a diverse sectoral mix to have resilient and long-term growth.
Thanks, Liam. I think we can open to wider questions. Please feel free to raise your hand and introduce yourself when you speak, and also feel free to ask questions and share any experiences you may have of these challenges and of course policy responses from your own country perspectives. Do we have any takers?
Stunned silence. If there are any people with sort of case studies from their local area and stuff, I'd be so interested to hear them, particularly around housing, actually.
Yeah, I think on the housing point, whilst people think about questions, I think, yeah, I think your key message was it's no longer just a social issue, but a core economic one, which obviously affects labour mobility, consumer spending, and in particular fairness. Affordable housing has risen up the agenda firmly. But again, in terms of policy responses, of course, you said housing supply is a key one, and others are less effective. But is there anything more that comes out from your analysis in terms of the factors that facilitate housing supply? Because of course there's multiple issues here. It's planning. It's also the cost of development is a major factor. But I'm not sure that came out in your presentation. I wonder whether any analysis has been done on that as well and underpinned your economic data.
Yeah, I mean, good question on the housing point. The main two policies I would say that need to underpin sort of unlocking housing supply and growth in the housing market is number one, planning. That obviously that probably isn't obvious, but I think we have to realise there is a trade-off between protecting some environmental measures or living standards within housing measures and actually building houses. To some extent, if you over-regulate in the housing space, you just end up with no housing. You don't just end up with housing that isn't at its absolute peak and the best in class. You end up with none. We need to find a balance between the regulation that we're putting in place, particularly in somewhere like the UK, and actually being able to unlock housing full stop. There are cities out there that do this well. We saw the example of Helsinki, another city that does housing very well. Well, I say city. A state of the US that does housing very well is Texas. Texas has very low regulations and very low planning constraints on building houses. Guess what that means for Texas? It means it's the fastest growing state in the US. It's got the strongest population growth of young people, and it has the fastest growing economy of the US. So you sort of can see how an economy that gets housing supply right not only gets more affordable houses, which is fair and good for people and attracting young people in particular, it also means you can get a booming economy on the back of it. And Texas clearly shows that. And when I look at the data on housing, you can clearly see, yes, the US as a whole has had significant falls in housing affordability in recent years. The falls in Texas have been one of the lowest falls of all of them. So actually, Texas has managed to maintain a relatively affordable picture, and that is all around planning. Second thing that you need to do is make sure that you've got a skilled construction worker pipeline. You need to invest in that skill set to ensure that the skilled workers in construction have the right skills to build housing, and you've got a pipeline of people able to support your industry. The problem that Europe's faced is a stop-start nature to construction, particularly because of the financial crisis that's been hard to recover from. But they're the two that I would personally prioritise. I think what the UK does very badly, and I would say the same for Europe actually more broadly, is understanding there are trade-offs to decision making. Not everything can be a priority. You do need to sometimes deprioritize certain things and have a negative impact in a certain way to actually achieve positive results overall. The policy that I absolutely would stress does not work is putting affordable housing quotas into place. You end up with less houses, and then they all become more unaffordable rather than more affordable.
Okay, thanks. So so you've summarised a couple of policy responses overall in terms of the industrial issue as well, spatial policy rather than sectoral policy. I'm not sure the EU is necessarily moving in that direction. There you can see in the next budget a big shift away from, for instance, cohesion policy, a 12% cut, and this is just at the negotiation stage, a shift into more sectorally oriented policies, a new competitiveness fund, massive increase in Horizon Europe funding, but other windows within this competitiveness heading, which you would think naturally focus on core areas of strength. To what extent have you done any analysis of these EU level policy initiatives that are emerging? Mm-hmm. And yeah, what's your view on the spatial approach to policy at the European level? Of course, cohesion policy has focused a lot of expenditure on Central and Eastern Europe, and you mentioned that there's been catch up there, but also that's been an important lever to develop these economies. So I guess the question is, how do you see the European Union policy perspective, and have you done any analysis of the implications for cities?
Yeah, we have looked at this actually. I mean, I think there's a few things to this. So I think it's very positive that the EU is really taking the housing issue very seriously. Like that is a core one, and seeing that rise up the agenda has been very good to witness. Second, I mentioned the point about sectoral policy not being my go-to, particularly for more service sector cities. I think the benefit of what the EU is doing is that it is focusing that funding on stuff like Horizon, so research and development, and it's focusing it on skills supply as well. So I think the focus on those two things are actually a big positive, and will hopefully lead to meaningful growth in productivity in those industries to help them compete. So that clearly is a benefit. There is obviously though a balance though here of how do you make sure that the policy you're doing isn't completely sectoral focused, which in turn means you're basically picking winners. The beauty of spatial policy is you're not picking sectoral winners. You're essentially trying to improve the foundations of growth, which I actually think historically the EU has done a really good job in because it focused so much on regeneration and amenity-based benefits. So moving away from that, if it was just moving away from that wholesale, that would be a negative. Because it's sort of balancing it with that boost in R&D spending, boosting skills and training spending, I think it's less negative than it otherwise might have been, would be my initial view on what it is that the European Union's doing. I think where it can sometimes be challenging from a European perspective, and this is something that the UK has had a political conversation about for a very long time and probably taken a very different view to the European Union, is EU spending tends to focus on places that are not performing as well, right? And to some extent, the policy shapes dispersion of economic activity rather than concentration of it. The UK has gone, well, the UK as an economy, France to some extent is as well, of concentration of economic activity in a core central capital major city. The two are sort of polar opposites to one another in terms of sort of high level policy that you might want to achieve. If we are trying to drive growth in service sector economies through spatial policy, you would say that the policy should be implemented in the largest cities because they have the greatest possibility of driving growth. Why? Because agglomeration returns have increasing returns to scale. The larger the city, the greater the agglomeration returns to it. So the European policy on this is actually quite different to a number of other countries, not least the UK and Japan. Which one's the best one to do? It's actually very hard to say, because if I look at two countries with a significant productivity problem, it's the UK and Japan. So I'm not entirely sure which is the best of the two of them. But I do think that Europe does need to have a think about how it does ensure it can get agglomeration benefits in its major cities to unlock that weak productivity growth that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years.
Thanks. Do we have any questions before I pick on people? I was struck by one of your charts, of course, UK, France, low productivity. And here I can see that I can see Alba with your video on whilst you're here. Italy came out with of course, a low productivity example, Spain as well. But wondering if I can ask Alba, to what extent do any of the issues raised by Liam strike a chord with the case of Italy from a national perspective, and what's your core policy focus to address some of these challenges?
Yeah, hello, Carlos. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's a lot. Thanks. So hello to everybody. I'm Alba Fagnani. I'm working at the Italian Department for Cohesion Policies. And yes, I have to say that I'd like to share a few reflections on this complex and quite layered topic, I have to say. Actually, one key dimension of the housing emergency that's getting more and more attention in Italy is the one linked with production, and I would say also with labor mobility, as in many areas, I mean large cities, but also growing industrial areas, workers are actually nowadays unable to access affordable housing. And this is not just a social issue, but it's becoming a structural constraint on labor markets, as housing costs are too high and relative to our income, and workers simply cannot move to where jobs are available. And as a result, we are witnessing an increasing mismatch between labor demand and supply, which of course can affect productivity and industrial productivity as well. And at the same time, there is another critical and I would say quite overlooked issue that we are witnessing, the shortage of technical and skilled workers that was mentioned also today, as many of those workers, especially in sectors like construction and manufacturing and services, are precisely those more affected by housing affordability, and they are often temporary workers and typically cannot afford market rents in high demand areas. I think about Rome or Milan or other places that are quite overcrowded. And this is where service housing can play a strategic role, and also by maybe providing controlled rent housing that is targeted at workers. It could both facilitate labor mobility and help also attract much needed technical skills to the Italian territories that need that most. And this potential, I would say, is particularly evident in if we look at the support we are giving through the midterm review of cohesion programs that it's on the go, which for the first time supports the middle class. And it's actually recognizing that housing affordability is no longer limited to the most vulnerable groups of the population. So actually in this context, my question would also be, as of course, as I said, housing affordability in Italy is becoming a structural constraint on labor mobility. What concrete policy measures could be adopted to expand affordable houses for workers, specifically for workers, while supporting local economic growth? Sorry, maybe I've gone a bit too long on that.
No, that was super helpful, and I find Italy such an interesting example of this. I know in Rome, one of the big policies that has been put in place by the mayor there has been actual direct provision of housing by the state. And I think that is probably the way that we have to start being about this, because the private sector simply isn't going to deliver it within the current constraints and the prices that they can receive, well, that they want to get from it, should I say. So I actually think what's happening in Rome, i.e. the direct delivery of housing provision, is probably a very, very good thing to do. I think the problem we've got at the moment is we try and fit this halfway house of trying to rely on the private sector to do it, giving them incentives to deliver, when actually the calculations for the housing providers just don't add up a lot of the time, and they're not in the public interest within this realm. So I think that some of the stuff that the Mayor of Rome is doing is absolutely spot on. I think what the Mayor of London is doing, which is putting the costs onto housing developers to create more affordable housing and stuff, is not the right way of doing it. I think I've said that a number of times during the call, but I really think putting these extra costs onto the private sector to deliver means you just get less houses, and that is the exact opposite of what we need in the current crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liam. Do we have any other questions? Let me come back with a final one. Then you were quite clear that this new issue of AI-driven growth is concentrated in a small number of tech and semiconductor hubs rather than widely shared, and you showed a couple of interesting maps on the UK. Again, a very difficult question, but what can national and city governments do now to make sure that all of this AI boom doesn't just deepen regional inequality, which it seems to be doing from examples such as Silicon Valley and specialist hubs, including Eindhoven?
Yeah, I mean that is the million-dollar question on this, isn't it? I mean, and even now we're probably not seeing wholesale gains from AI on productivity at all at the moment. I mean, maybe the odd place in the US, but even then, some of these places are going through a structural change where they would have seen strong growth regardless of the AI boom right now, to be honest. So our view internally is we aren't reaping the fruits of a big AI boom at the moment. There are some indications that it's growing. There are some specific places benefiting, like Eindhoven, but it's not wholesale. How do we ensure that growth can end up being inclusive? I think is a really difficult one. I think part of it is ensuring that people can tap into this regarding of wherever they're located is sort of number one. And part of that is to do with the more hybrid working and remote working environment that we've got today. How do we ensure people can stay where they are and have job opportunities without moving to where those opportunities are? You'd hope that something like an AI revolution or a tech revolution will actually lend itself to that type of behavior. So that's a potential positive from it. More broadly, my bigger concern is how do you support the people that are losing their jobs to automation? And that really is a manufacturing exposed shock. Even now, when I look at manufacturing trends in Europe or elsewhere, productivity in those sectors has actually gone up quite well over the last 5 to 10 years. But that's because employment has fallen quite significantly rather than output has increased significantly. If the next wave of automation and robotics leads to declining industrial bases, you could question the spending that the EU is doing on sort of improving productivity in these industrial sectors, because it won't lead to jobs. And that's the bigger concern, maybe. And the same is being seen in the US at the moment. Obviously, President Trump's big Made in America agenda and his tariffs agenda is all about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US. You might see manufacturing GDP go back to the US. I'm very doubtful you'll see any jobs. And that's something that the EU is going to have to manage.
Okay, thanks, Liam. Irene, do you have a question or observation?
Yeah, sorry for being a bit slow with the questions. There's so much to take in. It's quite difficult to know which question to ask. I wanted to ask a bit. It's a similar question to the one that Carlos has just posed, but in relation to sort of security and defence spending, and obviously France, Spain, Sweden, UK are sort of key hotspots in terms of the clustering of defence companies that will kind of in some ways benefit from this sort of increase in spending and demand. But equally, you've got sort of particularly eastern border regions where I guess governments will be wanting to try and retain populations, attract people from a kind of strategic point of view to keep these places populated, and infrastructure investments, I guess, as well, linked to kind of wider strategic thinking, how you kind of see that balance playing out as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's a difficult one for policymakers to manage here, given that there is a depopulation, particularly working age population, should I say, over the next 25 years across much of Europe. I think there's reasons to think that the brain drain that we saw previously from Central and Eastern Europe is actually reversing now. I think that is a big positive for the region in terms of population, actually. Like the long-term forecasts for these places, demographically speaking, is not strong still because of low birth rates and low immigration rates. But that previous sort of out-migration of people does seem to be being stemmed in recent years, which I think is a positive for the local economies in these places and is testament to the strong growth that they've had. How you balance that going forward with the big fiscal boom in some of these central cities such as Germany and France. I'm not entirely sure, but what I would say is if we think manufacturing employment as a whole is going to be performing poorly over the next few decades, there is a lot of budge in the labour market for people to pick those jobs up without needing mass migration of people to take up the job. So I think naturally that will sort of reduce pressures.
Okay, thanks, Liam. We're just over the hour now, so again, just wanted to thank you and also everyone for attending and your interest. I know some people have not asked questions, but probably do have them, so we will share Liam's great slides with you after the presentation, which will have his email on them, so you're welcome to contact Liam on the presentation, and I believe there are probably reports coming out on the presentation as well, so please feel free to contact Liam. Again, thanks for sharing your thoughts on the key economic challenges and also opportunities as well for European cities in the years ahead. Our next webinar of the series is planned, well, being planned at the moment, but we'll share updates on social media and our mailing lists. So please just get in contact with us for any future events. And also, if you're interested in presenting any of your research or policy initiatives, feel free to contact us as well. We'd be delighted to hear from you. You can email Marina Murray or myself, and we hope to see you again very soon for another webinar. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Liam.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.